Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first in our series of 5 talks, debates, dialogues, conversations about the history of construction, especially in New York and Chicago. And this, the first of the series of 4 sessions, 4 90-minute sessions, which is why we're starting at 5:30 tonight instead of our usual 6 o'clock, because we get to indulge in an hour and a half of discussion about the 2 cities, where we're going to feature talks by Donald Friedman and Tom Leslie, representing Chicago and New York. Don and Tom will talk in three other sessions on, and I will show you briefly the other topics, but frames, facades, fire, and then Alexander Wood will join us for a final kind of case study in this series on the Mills Building in Chicago, in New York, on Broad Street, a building of the 1880s that will show us in action and in the spectrum of that building's construction history, a lot about the environment of construction, the profession of construction as it was being established in the very earliest years of the skyscrapers. So this series is really meant to be a drill down into topics that we have already, and by we, I mean both the Skyscraper Museum and Don Friedman and Tom Leslie, have explored in several other sessions in the museum's history of programming. And I'm going to show you a few slides that will recall some of the genesis of this debate of New York versus Chicago, and the pairing, the kind of mutual affection that you will see in the expertise of both Don and Tom. Now, in order to make this not just the Don and Tom show for 4 running weeks, we have paired, or we have invited an additional professional expert to be the moderator for the dialogue that happens after the individual city presentation. So tonight that's Jared Green, who is a geotechnical engineer in the Philadelphia office of Langdon. I will introduce him with a little more fully after Tom and Don speak. But first I want to give a little bit of an overview and an introduction to the series. So this series is called Work in Progress: Construction History in New York and Chicago, and we're focusing on the very first decades of skyscraper history and going up to kind of the end of one phase of construction kind of evolution of course, steel skeleton framing in the 1930s. We're focusing mostly on the earlier work in this part of the series. And this is a continuation of some of the explorations that we did almost 2 years ago now in a kind of continuing semester symposium by contributing scholars, some of whom will return for this series, called Rewriting Skyscraper History. And that series was a response to well, to the historiography and to the new scholarship that surrounds the skyscraper, but also to a particular lens on skyscraper history that emphasizes first. I'll talk about that in a moment, but here are just a few screens that feature the first lectures in the series, moving up from foundations to frames, to separate a little bit out facades in order to talk about those. And you see at the top of the screen some of these analytical drawings that Tom Leslie has done with his students at Iowa State. And those are that kind of analysis Tom's going to talk about more over the course of the series. Tom Leslie is a professor, the Morrill Professor at Iowa State University. He has a long history of teaching studio. He worked as an architect before he became a professor, and he has for many years been defining himself as a preeminent historian of the Chicago skyscraper, first with this work that takes the first tranche of the decades 1871 to 1934, and now at work in the sequel to this book, which looks in depth at the post-war period. But I'm going to represent Tom and Don just with a single cover of one of their books, although they have many more to their names, and you can find those on our website. Donald Friedman is a structural engineer who is the head of his firm, Old Structures, here in New York, where he's practiced for about 30 years. This book, The Structure of Skyscrapers in America, is not only about New York, but New York is our he is the defender of and the deep down expert on New York architecture in our dialogue, our kind of binary between New York and Chicago. He is also the author of Historical Building Construction and numerous other works, informed both by his scholarship, but also in his work on historic structures in the city in his professional life. This series is in particularly instigated by another one that was about 3 years ago that was sponsored and kind of call for papers by the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat, a Chicago-based organization, and searching for a topic that would generate a lot of attention and lively debate. They picked the title First Skyscraper, and Don and Tom and I and others were on the steering committee for this program, and we all said, no, that's not the way we see the history, and we objected so vociferously that they added an S to the title of their symposium, and then they also kind of reversed the words in order to expand the topic into skyscraper firsts. But tonight, we're not talking about firsts, we're talking about evolution. Oh, these are some of the conspirator historians with my cursor on Tom Leslie's nose, and there's Don and Gail Fensky and Jerry Larson and me putting the hex sign against the allegation that the first skyscraper was the home insurance building, which was, as you can see in these slides, disproved during the demolition of the building. But it's taken a long time to erase that myth. We'll also address another myth tonight, the bedrock myth, and I think you'll understand why we object to that one as well. So the only thing I want to say before I try to get quickly off the screen is to talk about why foundations are first. Foundations, as you see here in the model, here in the Skyscraper Museum that was made for one of our exhibitions, the base of Richard Morris Hunt's Tribune building of 1874, which Skyscraper Museum believes is, along with the Western Union building, the first skyscraper, if you want to talk about very tall urban commercial buildings. And you can see in the Hunt drawing that down here where my cursor is, the ground floor is seen on these steps, but the building begins with the first bricks and the first stone at the subterranean level, the sub level of the street with the foundations. And so that's what we're talking about tonight. We are not talking about the lens of history that I especially have advanced, and especially through the museum and through my now 25-year-old book, Form Follows Finance, where the argument that it's land and economics that determine the location and the shape of skyscrapers, but we're not looking at that tonight, even though that argument can be made in a series of images that contrast the platting of the land in Chicago and in New York, Chicago's big square blocks, and the resulting forms of the buildings opened at the center in their light courts. But that's not what we're talking about tonight, not the difference between the typical skyline in New York and Chicago in the 19-teens, but rather the difference in the sub-ground level that generates different responses by the engineers and the architects. So at this point now, I'm going to invite Tom Leslie to come onto the screen.
Well, thank you, Carol, and thank you all for coming out tonight. It's always great to see 100 or so people who are willing to talk about dirt and mud and foundations and things like that. So very grateful for the audience and for the invitation. The foundations are one of the things that Don and I both think draw a distinction between construction in New York and construction in Chicago. And so what I want to do tonight is to talk a little bit about the evolution of foundations, particularly in Chicago, why they evolved the way they did, and to suggest that this is one factor that influenced the difference in skyscraper construction and skyscraper massing and form between the two cities. One of the really defining characteristics of Chicago is that geographically, it is one of the best places in the world to build tall buildings because it's always been at the center of various trade and exchange routes. Geologically, it is probably one of the worst places in the world to build a skyscraper because sitting at the junction of a slow-moving river and a very large lake, the soil underneath the city of Chicago is largely fluid, meaning that it's compressible, it's squishy, and it tends not to stay in one place when you put a heavy object on top of it. The terrain, the underground terrain varies throughout the loop, but in general, there is about 15 feet of fill and sand, silt, sort of soil that tends to get scraped off. And then there's a large depth of clay that goes from very, very soft clay near the top to very, very hard clay about between 65 and 100 feet below ground level. That clay is the result of silt accumulating at the mouth of the Chicago River and gradually settling, and the upper layers compress the lower layers until you get what is variously called tunnel clay or hard pan down at that 65 to 80 foot level. The one sort of fortunate thing is that the geology of the soil under Lake Michigan is in part determined by the fact that the lake has risen and fallen over the years. And there is this very, very thin layer of desiccated or dried clay called hard pan that's about 15 or 20 feet below the original ground level. That is really the only stratum anywhere near the surface that you can put any weight at all on. And so for many years, the way that you built the buildings in commercial Chicago, 5, 6, 7 stories, was either to build what's called a mat foundation, so just a very, very large, thick layer of concrete and rubble down at the hard pan level, resting directly on it. This is an ancient technique. The Colosseum in Rome sits on a 24-foot thick concrete mat foundation. That's the way that you build a giant heavy stadium on a swamp. The other way that was used largely for structures on the river itself was piling. And piling works in two ways. Today, we're very confident building what are called friction piles, which rely on the fluid pressure of the soil around them to build up resistance. If you think about trying to pound a broomstick into the beach, eventually you can't go any further because the grip of the sand around the stick becomes too great. But in the 19th century especially, that wasn't seen as reliable. And so what was often done was piles were built down to the harder strata well below the surface. So down to the lower clay levels or down to that lower hard pan layer of boulders and really compressed clay. The problem with this is that it is hard to get 70-foot long timbers, possible but expensive. And so often the solution was to drive one set of piles and then to put another set of piles on top of them and drive those and sort of hope that the piles stayed aligned as they went down. There are obvious problems with both of these foundation techniques. In the case of those timber piles, it's very possible that you actually miss and that the piles end up not aligning and therefore not bearing on each other. In the case of mat foundations, the failures were a little bit more complicated, and they had to do with the fact that the concrete itself, even though engineers would assume that it was perfectly stiff, was actually flexible, not very flexible, but flexible enough that the loads that were put onto the foundation and the uplift from the clay between very often created this phenomenon where the heavier outer walls would sink further, would very often start to bend outward, and the inner floors that had less weight than the bearing exterior would kind of rise up. And so you'd get floors that would crown, and you would get differential settlement of various bits of structure. Most notoriously, these failures were seen in two of the most prominent city buildings of the 1870s and 1880s, the Federal Building or Post Office and Custom House in 1875, and the new City Hall in 1885. The post office was built on a mat foundation that broke up and fell apart. City Hall was built on piles. They were supposed to be single piles, but the contractor did them in two stages, and there are reports of piles sort of getting loose and actually coming to the surface, half a block away or something. Both buildings fell apart essentially because of the problems with the foundations. General Suey Smith, you see on the left, he's a figure that will come back in Chicago Foundation history, describes the Federal Building as a combination of ignorance and rascality, right? So there's obviously also a sense that workmanship is maybe partly to blame as well. So how do you solve this? Well, if you're building on hardpan, a builder, one of Chicago's earliest architects and builders, Frederick Bauman, in 1873 published a pamphlet where he said that really the problem with mat foundations was its monolithic nature, and that the way to get around the breakup of mat foundations was to isolate the loads in a building onto individual piers, and to basically build small isolated mat foundations for each load that you were bringing down in the building. So for every column, you would put it on a pad that you calculated based on what you knew the minimal bearing capacity of the soil was, and what you estimated the dead load that you were putting onto it was. Fairly simple calculation. The strength of the soil is measured in pounds per square feet. The measure of the load is measured in pounds. So if you know the number of pounds, you know the number of square feet that you have to spread the foundation out over. The key thing, though, in this was that Bauman's first rule was to resolve the building into isolated parts. In other words, to avoid putting bearing walls or anything where the flow of forces would be at all complex, to eliminate those and to replace them with isolated piers or later columns. All of these were difficult. The third rule especially was problematic. Bauman rightly said that the loads all had to come down in the middle of these pads. And this is a difficult thing to do if you're building a lot line building. So things like cantilever foundations had to be developed to accommodate these. But the sort of genius of this was that you could, in fact, by, for instance, piling stone in pyramids that would mediate between the size of the pier above and the area of soil or hardpan that you need to spread the load out on top of. You could do that relatively easily if you knew the loads and if you knew the strength of the soil. And so initially, these pyramidal foundations were reasonably successful in spreading these loads out. And eventually we got what were called grillage foundations. Engineers realized that the bending capacity of first railroad iron and then eventually steel I-beams could be used to create much more efficient foundations and to open up more basement space below. Now, I have a kind of theory about this, which says that if you start thinking about your building in terms of isolated foundations instead of walls, you get something that we think of as a very natural Chicago response, the skeleton frame. And the argument goes something like this, that in cities where it is easy to get to a very strong foundation soil like bedrock, you're very naturally going to think about the perimeter of your building as a set of bearing foundations that might be a little wider, that'll have a spread at the bottom, mostly for stability. But as soon as you think about your foundations as walls, then I think you start to think about the exterior of your building as walls, and that the windows in them are kind of punched into something that starts out as a structural element that's a plane. You may use iron and steel beams and girders to span between these walls, but essentially If you have easy foundations, you're likely to think about two-dimensional solutions and therefore to extrude that up into your building itself. In Chicago, if you're following Bauman's prescription that you are resolving all the loads into points, then I think you're thinking about your building more in terms of linear elements, in terms of piers or columns that come up from these pyramidal bases that you see here. And then you're thinking not about building walls above, but you're thinking about connecting those vertical elements, those linear elements, with steel girders, steel beams, wrought iron girders and beams at first, of course. And then just filling in what you need to between those piers. So we see the rise of the spandrel, right? Just enough solid on the outside to keep people from falling out of windows, but not thinking about the exterior necessarily as a solid wall to begin with. And as you think about grillage foundations in particular, when steel becomes available, my hunch is that you think about the entire building not now as a network of walls and beams, but rather as a network of skeletal elements, right? Coming up from the kind of lily pads or snowshoes that form the foundations and making a recognizable structural grid. I think you can see that a little bit in the first generation of spread footing buildings. These were all done in 1884. None of them survive anymore. But you can see that the building is resolved into piers. That's not unique to Chicago, but I think it's a particularly important Chicago approach. And you can also see that architects are maybe less willing to think about a variety of massing, that the so-called dry goods box that comes out of Chicago, the kind of boxy rectilinear form with the flat top, is in part a response to the resolution of the loads into isolated foundations and wanted to keep those more or less similar. Towers are problematic because they put more load on the soil and therefore risk differential settlement, right? The tower may shrink more or less as you do the calculations. The Pullman building, the third from the left, is the exception to the rule. There's a lightweight timber framed turret on the edge, but that is not something that you typically see. And I think there's a good reason for that, right? That spread footings imply that you want to keep the building more or less simple. Spread footings are relatively popular throughout the 1880s. They are reasonably successful. William LeBaron Jenney, when he writes about the home insurance building, doesn't title his essay "The World's First Skeleton Frame." He titles it "A Tall, Fireproof, Heavy Building on Compressible Soil." And most of his self-reporting about the home insurance is not about the structural innovations above, but rather most of the article is actually about how he calculated the spread foundations down below in the soil itself. Not everyone was as brilliant as Jenney, though, and there were plenty of what I would call minor failures or serviceability failures in spread footings throughout Chicago. Differential settlement, buildings like the Fisher building that actually lean up to 12 or 18 inches, building entrances like in the auditorium building where you actually walk down about 14 inches to get into the lobby instead of up. So while these were serviceable and more or less worked, they were also controversial. And Dankmar Adler in particular in 1891 pointed out that there was a ready-made solution right there, which was that the grain elevators and warehouses that lined the Chicago River had not used spread footings, but instead had actually sat up atop driven piles. And Adler, in this sort of lengthy quote, points out that grain elevators carried much more load than skyscrapers. That load was dynamic because it was moving around. The grain was getting put in and taken out. And maybe most important, the grain elevators were all built alongside the river, which was the worst soil in Chicago. So beginning in 1891, Adler starts to campaign, along with others, for a better, more reliable solution than spread footings. And what he campaigns for, on the one hand, he points out that the grain elevators sat on friction piles that didn't necessarily go all the way to hardpan, the lower hardpan strata. But he also says and uses piles that go down all the way to this more robust stratum well below the ground level. And the Garrick Theater, the Schiller building, which he and Sullivan do in 1892, actually uses piles that go down to what he calls tunnel clay, the lower stratum of the compressible blue clay. William Sui Smith, who is a civil engineer with, like Jenny, a Civil War pedigree, he specializes in tunnel construction, and he designs the pile foundations that go under the post office's replacement. The building eventually finished in 1905 by Henry Ives Cobb, where the Meese post office is now. The pile foundations are successful. They are probably the only good part of this building. It's technically one of the worst buildings probably ever built in Chicago, but it is not one that is subjected to differential settlement. And Sui Smith learns from this, understands that piles represent a way to get past the differential settlement problems that come with spread footings. Now, Sui Smith is a tunnel engineer by training, and he's a great example of when the tool you have is a hammer, every problem becomes a nail. When he works on an extension to the Chicago Public Library, or a renovation, a quick renovation a couple of years after the Chicago Library is built, he comes up with this idea that to mitigate the problems of obtaining long piles and to make sure that those piles are always embedded in wet soil, right? He's worried that all of the drainage projects in the loop are going to lower the water table, something that has not actually happened. Timber is vulnerable to rot when it dries out and gets wet again. And so Sui Smith is obsessed with the idea of keeping timber piles below the water table. And he comes up with this idea of making deep piles by first excavating kind of deep basements, right? Large trenches, so that you're starting to drive the piles at 15, 20, 30 feet below ground level. This is what they do for the library. Sui Smith notes that the clay, while it's compressible and fluid, is not so fluid that you have to actually keep the water out. You can use simple lagging to keep most of the clay from infiltrating the trenches. And he says, once you're done with the piles, you can build masonry walls that form the bottom of a reasonably good structure. And he actually says, while he's doing this, you could imagine actually digging those trenches all the way down to bedrock. The lagging would work, of course, as you get through the stiffer and stiffer clay. And he says you could actually put masonry piers that go all the way down to the better stratum below. So the solution that Sui Smith has for deep bearing piles is to first dig a big trench, then drive the piles, and then build the masonry foundation above it. And this leads very quickly to Adler's realization that you might as well dispense with piles altogether. And since it's possible to simply dig the well all the way down to hardpan or to bedrock, you might as well just use the lagging and dig those wells and just fill that with rubble, concrete, masonry, whatever. And so we get the birth of what becomes called the Chicago caisson. This is not a pneumatic caisson, a caisson in the traditional bridge building sense, because there's no forced air or pressurized air trying to keep the water out. Instead, it is more of an open well foundation, right? That they dig or drill a well and then fill that with masonry or concrete. And the first example of this in Chicago, there are other examples in Kansas City, for instance. And Darren Von Stein has sent Don and me a brilliant collection of essays and data on all of the various caisson constructions in the 1890s throughout New York and Chicago. But the first Chicago building to use this technique is the Stock Exchange. Adler is worried, based on his experience with the Garrick Theater, that all of this pile driving can damage neighboring buildings. There's a particularly fragile building next door to the Stock Exchange. And so to protect it, Adler and Sui Smith designed these open well caissons along the western wall of the Stock Exchange. So they're digging instead of pounding, and the Herald building doesn't actually collapse or fall down because of all of the vibrations from the piles. Now, the caissons become very, very popular after 1900. They are, of course, labor intensive to build. They have all of the problems associated with deep excavations, but they become necessary because in 1904, the Chicago telephone tunnel system gets installed throughout the loop below the hard pan level, and therefore it is seen as vulnerable to new spread foundation constructions. And there are no spread foundations basically built on that upper hard pan layer after 1904-05. I think that the caissons actually usher in an era of slightly different construction in Chicago. You can see as early as 1911, very tall buildings with light courts where the loads on the foundation are very, very different from the taller portion of the building to the light court portion of the building. This is something that, of course, the light court has been in use since the 1880s, but here you have buildings that are 2 or 3 times as tall as those earlier ones, on caissons that go all the way down to bedrock. More perhaps obvious are the tower, or the block-in tower, or the streamlined Art Deco skyscrapers of the 1920s. The caisson foundations are necessary but not sufficient to explain the variety of massing there. And because the caissons in Chicago are much more similar to the sorts of foundations that Don is going to talk about here in a second, there's at least one reason that buildings of the 1920s in Chicago begin to look in their massing and configuration a bit more like buildings in New York. So I will leave it there, and I think we will go to Don now for the equivalent in New York City, and hopefully then come back and be able to do some comparison between these two histories.
Thank you, Tom. Let me get my slides up here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So I actually have a much, this is not going to be true in every lecture, but today I have a much easier job than Tom because people in New York spent much less time thinking about foundations in the era we're talking about, the early days of skyscrapers, because they didn't have to. And being a good engineer, I let the architect draw this for me. So thank you, Tom, for the slide. The most important thing to understand about underground conditions in New York is that they vary a great deal. We have a very good bedrock, and its height varies a lot. I'm going to show you a slide later on for the municipal building where one end of the building bedrock is something on the order of 180 feet below grade. In most of Manhattan, it's not that far down. There are places in Midtown where it's 20, 25 feet down, Midtown and actually Uptown as well. In lower Manhattan, it varies in the space of a couple of blocks sometimes. So what we usually have is a layer of sand, which is reasonably good material, and then you get into sort of the transition from sand to rock as you go down. And the 3 different pieces here are meant to indicate different conditions. You always have the same material. The question is, what height does the rock start at, and what height does the sand start at? So for a very long time, people were building buildings in New York and resting on sand. We still build buildings in New York resting on sand. And what it means is that we as a general rule, did not have the kinds of problems that Tom has been talking about in Chicago. Yes, buildings in New York settle, and buildings in New York have had foundation problems. That's true pretty much everywhere. But what we don't have is the systemic problem where you have to worry that you won't be able to find good bearing material for your building, either now or 140 years ago. For people who work in New York, this map is instantly recognizable. This is an 1865 map by an engineer named Egbert Viely. And what he did was overlay the street plan as it existed at that time in 1865 over the best reconstruction he could make of what Manhattan looked like before Europeans started leveling the hills and filling in the valleys. There's things you can quibble about his reconstruction of the mid 17th century, but it's probably the most accurate information we have about that. Just below the letter B on this map, for example, you see what looks like an inlet. That wasn't actually a natural inlet. That was a canal that the Dutch colonists dug up the line of what's now Broad Street. The light green is meant to be good land, good soil. The dark green is swamp. You can see there's some ponds. The pond to the right of the letter D is the collect pond, which was actually the source of fresh water for New York before we polluted it and then filled it in. The tan represents landfill between 1624 and 1865. Just for reference, landfill did not stop in 1865. The letter A on this map is where the Skyscraper Museum is located, and the Skyscraper Museum is not on a boat. So you can see here that, if you look at Lower Manhattan, letters E, C, and F are showing you Park Row, that's City Hall Park next to it. So what we think of as the financial district is basically south of City Hall Park, to the left of City Hall Park. It's not a very big area, and the conditions vary widely in it. And that shows up, since this is the part of the city that got skyscrapers first, this was the commercial heart of the city. The fact that the soil conditions vary so much in this small area gives you sort of a feeling for, it's not the same. It's not Chicago where you have the same problem everywhere, different problems at different locations. There's something that is reasonably regularly done in New York that is, as far as I know, has never been done in Chicago, and that is removing bedrock because it's too high. That's very much not a Chicago problem. B, C, D, E, and F that I've marked out here are buildings I want to talk about. They're all very roughly the same height, and therefore, in theory, have something like the same foundation loads. They were all built between, I guess it's 1885 and 1910. So just to sort of look at some similar buildings and the different solutions that were used to build foundations for these buildings. I think the word contingent is the most important thing on this slide. Before people were building skyscrapers, as Tom actually said, people simply built masonry walls into the ground and built up from there. Very often the entire site would be excavated down to the bottom of the wall level and then fill put back between the walls. So a lot of times you see fill in basements where there wasn't necessarily any reason for it. One of my slides later is going to show an inverted arch foundation, which was a very clever idea that people had mostly in the third quarter of the 19th century. It's a clever and terrible idea because it doesn't really work properly, but it was used again and again because people thought it was a way to deal with the increasing loads from as buildings got bigger and bigger. Where good bearing material was relatively close to the surface, people continued to just build masonry foundations on top of that bearing material. In short, if there was not a reason to do something else, they didn't do something else. Piles and wood piles up until 1900, and then around 1900, various forms of precast concrete pile enter use, were used where where good material was sort of at a medium distance, where you didn't have the problem that Tom was talking about of needing to get very deep, very long piles to very deep bearing. And then we have used open caissons, such as Tom has described in New York. They're used today. But when people were talking about caissons in New York in the early skyscraper days, what they meant were pneumatic caissons. And I'll have a slide that shows what that is in reasonably good detail. Let's get on to the more interesting pictures of buildings. So the World building, let me start with this one. This was on Park Row and Frankfurt Street, and Frankfurt Street no longer exists. Like the World building, it was pretty much wiped out for extension of the approaches to the Brooklyn Bridge. This was the tallest building in the world from 1890 to 1892, so fleeting fame. And as you can see, the reddish, orangish, pinkish color is meant to be brick. The blue is stone, and that's mostly used as facing. And the gray is also stone. I believe that may be rubble. And each of these masonry piers for this very tall building was 310-foot tall building, come down and simply rest we simply have a spread footing and it rests on the bearing stratum at the bottom. In between wall N-O and pier Q down at the bottom, you can see it's 35 feet from grade down to the foundation bottom level. The world building was not a skeleton frame. It was not a bearing wall building. It was a combination of the two. And if you see that those streaks of blue representing granite that are sort of below the second floor from grade, those are bases for cast iron columns that are running up through the building. And what they're bearing on is the huge brick pier foundation below. So the heavy masonry bears on, I don't think it's on rock, I think it's on hardpan. And then the cast iron columns are simply bearing on the masonry. So this is very much a hybrid type of situation. And again, at wall N-O, you can see, as Tom was talking about, the pyramids, and at pier T as well, you can see the way that the brick splays out to spread out the load. So this is that idea of spreading out the load to get an equal pressure below each pier. And I want to come back to that actually with the next slide, I think. So this is a section through the world building. There are your inverted arch foundations at the bottom. And the idea of that, if you think about an arch in its normal orientation, flipped upside down from this, a distributed load across the top of the arch is converted by the arch into 2 point loads at the ends. So somebody said, well, if we flip an arch upside down, can we convert the point loads into a distributed load below and use that as a form of spread footing? That works great in theory. The problem with it is that the loads aren't going to be exactly the same from column to column. And if you try to make an arch work with different reactions at the bottom, a true arch with different reactions at the bottom, the arch deforms, but these arches can't deform because they're trapped on top of the soil. You end up with very different pressure under different columns with this kind of foundation, which is not, it's not the end of the world. And this building did not have any significant foundation failure, but it didn't work the way it was supposed to. And that's probably the worst thing an engineer can say about a form of structure. If it's not working the way it's supposed to, you can't be sure it's going to work properly when you need it to do so. However, and I think this section shows things very nicely, we have a series of interior cast iron columns resting on separate foundations. It would be better if they were spread footings than the inverted arches, but we'll take what we've got. Tom's theory that wall foundations sort of lead you to walls above and isolated foundations lead you to a skeleton above. My first reaction to that theory is we have here isolated columns in the middle of the building. So it's not as if New Yorkers were building walls everywhere inside their buildings and people in Chicago were not. Both groups of buildings have isolated columns in the interior, at least starting circa 1870 or so. So this is, this almost follows Bauman's idea of having isolated separate foundations to equalize the soil pressure. Had they not used the inverted arches, they could have actually got there. But they did what they did. Now we get to the difference between the word caisson in New York and Chicago. So the Manhattan Life building was at 66 Broadway. This was also the tallest building in the world briefly, 1894 to 1899. Just to give you a sense, the tallest building in the world at 348 feet. The tallest occupied building at 348 feet. I want to go through each of these plans separately because they show different things. So this is the entire floor plan of the building. It was not very big, 66 feet wide north to south on the east end, 67 feet on the west end, and 120, 125 feet deep. So it's not a big building. As Carol was talking about, New York tends to have fragmented lots. This plan represents the caissons that were used to support the columns. Every place you see a number, that's a column. So on the upper left, we have column 1 and 2, lower left, we have column 3, and so on. And there are 32 columns in the entire building, and all but 2 of them are directly supported on caissons. And I want to get to the issue of how do you deal with columns that are right up against the lot line, because this was a continual problem in New York on the vast majority of buildings. Columns 6 and 7 are not on caissons, and I will show a picture of how they were supported. As you can see, the caissons are all over the place. They're different shapes, different sizes, different orientations. In part, the different orientation is because New Street, which is on the far right, is not parallel to Broadway on the far left. But that explains why caisson F and caisson O are not vertical, but doesn't explain, for example, why caisson L is the way it is. And the short answer for this very wide variety of caissons is that the building frame was not as regular as it might have been, because there were other considerations. Some of them were architectural. In between columns 2 and 3 on the left was the grand entrance to the building, and therefore there are no columns there. Some of them have to do with the neighboring buildings. I believe column 12 at the bottom of the drawing was moved because of a condition involving, as Tom described in Chicago, a delicate neighboring building. So this doesn't tell us very much other than where the caissons were. This is what went on top of the caissons. And again, I am going to come back to the caissons themselves in a minute, but this is what went on top of them. And all of the things you're seeing here are steel. So if we look at, on the upper right, columns 28 and 29, they rest on top of a series of beams running more or less east-west, and those beams rest on top of a much longer series of beams running more or less north-south. That's the steel grillage, and that is spreading out the load from the columns so that it is uniformly distributed over the caisson itself. This was being used because the short version is they didn't have reinforced concrete. So rather than worrying about concrete strength, they simply used steel, which they were very comfortable with, to spread out the loads. That's what a grillage is. It's using steel to spread the load over a given area to reduce the load intensity. Columns 6 and 7 don't rest on caissons. If you look at the left-hand side, column 7 is resting on a series of girders that span from the caisson K up to where column 6 is. Column 6, and I don't know the reason for this, I would love to find out, is the only column that does not rest on a caisson, it rests on a pile cap. In other words, you can see those round lines around where column 6 is. They drove piles for one column. The text that accompanied this article said something along the lines of the soil was better in that area. That just sounds strange because I can't believe the soil was uniform everywhere except at column 6. In any case, column 6 has piles in the pile cap. The girder that column 7 rests on spans from caisson K to the pile cap at column 6, which is marked P. And then we have pretty much the same thing. We have a series of grillages, and we have sitting on top of the caissons. In the middle of the drawing, at caisson H, column 14 and 21, you see that funny looking thing that doesn't look like a grillage. That is a big cast iron base, also used to spread out the load. Most likely the reason that the cast iron was used there rather than the grillage is that the load on those columns was smaller and did not need as much support. Here's a blow up. Whoa, I did not mean to do that. Okay, here is a blow up of the grillage. So again, each C13, C14, C15, C16 are those are 4 steel beams that are spanning across. If you look up at caisson D, every one of those rectangles that is underneath those 4 beams represents another beam at right angles to it. So that is the grillage. I believe not in my slides, but in some of Carol's slides, we have a very nice photograph of a grillage. This is a section through the entire building. There's column 6 and its piles towards the left, where it says boiler room under sidewalk. So that's a sidewalk vault below Broadway. And then there are the caissons down at bedrock, caisson A, caisson I, caisson H, and so on. So just to, some of you may know this, but just to go through it, what actually is a pneumatic caisson? This is the first, Manhattan Life was the first building that these were used for in the United States. They were basically big boxes that don't, without a bottom. So picture a box has a top, it has 4 sides, it does not have a bottom. You rest it on top of the ground. You put workers inside, and they start digging, and they undermine the box. And as they undermine it, it sinks down into the ground. You then build on top of it, and as you can see, they were building brick piers on top of it. So while you have laborers inside the box removing earth, you have another group on top of the box building a brick pier. And obviously, as the box gets deeper and deeper, they are building the men building the pier stay at the same elevation. They're right about at the cellar elevation. They're called pneumatic caissons because sooner or later groundwater is going to start to seep in, and in order to keep the groundwater out so that people can stay inside and keep digging, you fill up the box with compressed air. This technique was not developed for building foundations. It was developed for building mid-river piers for bridges. The first use in the United States was a small bridge, and I forget where it was. It was a very small caisson. I think the second use, and certainly the first major use, was the Eads Bridge in St. Louis, which has 2 piers in the middle of the Mississippi River. And they had quite large caissons that had to go down something on the order of 100 feet because underneath the Mississippi is, again, bad material, a lot of silt. The next big use in the United States was just a few years later, and that was the piers for the Brooklyn Bridge. So people in New York had seen pneumatic caissons. Well, they hadn't seen them because you don't see them because they're underground, but they had heard about them since the 1870s. So the concept was not something new. They were used for buildings because it was a known way to dig down a long distance. If you think about the open caissons used in Chicago, that was something of an experiment in the United States at the time they were first used in Chicago. And people in New York weren't indulging in that experiment. They were indulging in a different experiment of taking a bridge building technique for foundations and adapting it to building use. So you can, this I think shows a very nice section, and we have this break line that makes it look as if the cellar was very close to bedrock. It was not. These caissons were, I believe, more than 80 feet deep. So this gives you a sense of what it looks like. This is the different location, and this shows how you deal with the neighbors. So again, this is the short direction across the building. We have three caissons at the bottom. And what we have is a very big steel girder that runs from the caisson on the left over the caisson in the middle, over a support on the left side of the caisson on the right, and then it ends at the right side of the caisson on the right. And since this was a mostly skeleton frame building, at the far left of the girder, it's supporting a column, and at the far right of the girder, it's supporting a column. So the walls that need to be supported there were relatively light. They were just curtain walls. At the far left, you see column 33 at the upper left-hand side of the drawing, and then just to the left of that, it says wall of adjacent building. So in terms of the large loads in column 33, they were being carried by this steel girder as a cantilever. The wall load that was around column 33 was relatively small. So this is what we still do today to some extent. This is how you get around the fact that you can't build a proper foundation right at the lot line because it's going to interfere with the neighbor. What you can do is you can cantilever your exterior, your side walls and your side columns to pick up that load. Also in the break line between the upper portion of the drawing and the lower portion of the drawing, new concrete foundation inserted under old walls, otherwise known as underpinning. So they were dealing with these delicate neighbors as best they could. This is yet world's tallest building. It was 1890 to 1899. The Park Row building, and interestingly enough, this is an English journal describing what those wacky Americans were doing. This is a floor plan of the building. It has a very irregular site. Park Row is on the right. We have a lot line at the bottom and a lot line at the top. The extension on the upper left, looks vaguely like a chimney, is actually a short facade on Ann Street. And then diagonally on the lower left, we have a longer facade on Theater Alley, which is very much an alley. It's about 15 feet wide. This is an almost 400-foot tall building, 390 or so, built on wood piles. So let me zoom in. Every one of those little circles represents a wood pile driven into the ground. Somebody took pity on the draftsman and didn't make him draw in the piles under every single piece of it. So for example, just to the right here where we have these white squares, those are pile caps as well. They just didn't draw it all in. Here's one of the pile caps where they did draw it in. But if we go down to the bottom of this drawing, we have a section. And here you can see there are wood piles. And then there is a granite, we can call it a pile cap, we can call it whatever you want, a layer of granite directly on top of those wood piles, and then a brick pyramid, and then another layer of granite. And what went on top of the top layer of granite was a steel grillage. So you've got a very modern steel structure sitting on top of masonry, some of which is brick, sitting on top of wood piles. This building is now 120 plus years old, no foundation problems. These foundations are functioning just fine. They just look very odd to us. Back to the plan here, you can see the outline of the columns, those rectangles that are along the bottom. Those are the steel columns going up. And you've got, again, these funny looking diagonals and sort of a V here. There's a column at each end, and then you've got a masonry pile cap connecting them. And there's again, a steel grillage that runs the full length of that. So I think this is a good example of something that was not likely to be built in Chicago, in part because it would be a mistake, but that worked just fine. The soil at the Park Row building is better than the soil at Manhattan Life. It's dense sand, and the piles were driven into refusal, which Tom described very nicely earlier. He was talking about trying to drive a broomstick into the beach. You get to the point where you can't make it move anymore, that is refusal. So when you're pounding on a pile and it doesn't keep moving down, you've reached the point where you can stop. Just another example, the Havemeyer building is a little out of my my general description. It's a little bit shorter than the other ones. It's 1891, but it's worth, this is the pile plan and pile cap plan for the building. And where it says piling plan 4 feet to 1 inch on the right there, just below that, someone has written in by hand, total number of piles, 2,238. And they are every one of them on this drawing. And if they're center line of pillars, meaning the steel columns. So there's column E2 to the left of where it says center line of pillars, column F2 to the right of it. This all looks actually sort of modern. This is what we do, except that we no longer do it on top of wood piles. But again, this worked just fine. What's interesting about this is that those piles were being driven very near the 6th Avenue elevated trains. And these days, if anyone is in the audience has tried to work on new foundations adjacent to a subway line, there are a lot of regulations about the loads you can put on subway structures and the vibration you can cause. I suspect that these 2,000 plus piles were driven, and anybody who happened to be on the elevator as it drove past felt it. But that's sort of a side issue. Somewhat newer building. The municipal building was completed in 1913. Real construction started around 1910. It has two wings with, at the base, Chambers Street running in between them. The building is over Chambers Street, so and that portion of the street is now blocked to traffic, but it's still open to pedestrians. This was meant to be a building supported on caissons to rock. It was known that the soil was not very good at this particular location. And this is about 2 blocks from Park Row, which was on good enough material to use piles. And in this location, it was known early on they were going to have to use caissons to rock. If you look at the information on the upper left, grade is about 30 feet above sea level. And at the time that this was drawn, 4 caissons had gone all the way down to rock. If you look in the lower right, near where it says Tryon Row, we have a square caisson labeled as minus 101 feet. So that caisson had gone down to rock 101 feet below sea level, or in other words, 130 feet below grade. There are 3 others. It's a little hard to see the hatching, but there are 3 others that had been driven to roughly the same depth. The problem, so on this plan, north is to the left. The problem came at the north wing, and if you look at the just above where it says Figure 1, you have the elevations of bedrock. And bedrock at minus 158 feet, minus 177 feet, minus 177 feet from sea level, which is to say more than 200 feet below grade. That is a very, very long way to drive a caisson. The solution was that all the caissons didn't go to rock. And this is a nice section because it shows you a couple of the issues involved here. The line that starts at minus 100 on the far right and then goes off to the left and dives down to the lower left corner, that's the height of bedrock. You see at the top the street surface, and then they excavated, it says about 32 feet for cellars, for the 2 cellars of the building. And then groundwater, so mean tide level, in other words, sea level, we'll call it. The groundwater is 6 feet below that, it says about, and then you have, from that point, some 70 feet down to bedrock on the south wing, but on the north wing, it varies tremendously. And the decision was made that since the material on top of bedrock was good, compact sand, that the caissons could sit on that rather than extending down to rock. So the municipal building has sort of the interesting foundation that the whole building is on caissons. And let me just come back here. All of those circles and squares and rectangles represent caissons. But half of them go to rock and half of them don't. So I was talking before about contingent solutions. I think this is about as clear an example of that as you can come up with. One last thing I just wanted to mention, and that is, I've been talking about this, and actually let me go back to here. Obviously, the load varies as you go across the building here. Columns 33, 21, 26, and 23 do not have the same load. The ends of the big plate girder are supporting the side walls, which is a load that doesn't exist at the middle. Each column has a separate load and is carrying a separate amount. That you can easily do that if you have foundations to rock. In Tom's slide of the Chicago Stock Exchange, and maybe he can put that back up for a second later on. The Chicago, in part as a reaction to the fire of 1871, had a very strict rule about firewalls at the rear lot lines of buildings. And the Chicago Stock Exchange building, the street-facing walls and the court-facing walls are largely open, but there's this very big, heavy wall at the rear of the building. And if you think about that building being supported on a compressible soil, that rear wall is going to settle a different amount than the rest of the building, and it's basically going to rip the building apart. So when you are being required to build something like that firewall, you have to have foundations that can take different pressures, and one way of doing that is caissons to rock. In New York, we didn't necessarily have such strict rules about firewalls, but what we did have was extraordinarily heavy ornamented facades facing the streets. Much more ornamental masonry on the street sides than in Chicago. And that is the same problem. You have a lot of weight on one side of the building. If you don't have good foundations, that's going to tend to rip the building apart. So while there are certainly a lot of differences, and I think that between the two of us, we've covered them, that issue is the same in both cases, that you have to have, back to Bauman again, the idea of having isolated foundations to have separate loads and equalize the bearing pressure. It's particularly important when you have different loads on different parts of the building. And even if Chicago tended to build blocky buildings without towers, they still had things like firewalls, light courts. So the load varied from one side of the building to another. That's inevitable. And you have to have a way of dealing with it, either by having separate footings or by going to rock, so that you can have separate footings give you equal bearing pressure, and therefore, in theory, equal amounts of settlement, or going to rock and you don't have any settlement. And I think I'm done.
So I will be very briefly introducing Jared Green, who you can see here with his earpieces on, looking very professional, because he is in fact a professional geotechnical engineer who works in the Philadelphia office of Langen, who specialize especially in foundations, tunnels, and such underground things. He works from the Philadelphia office, but on New York and the metropolitan area, also Pennsylvania and New Jersey. So Jared is from his Jared was suggested by Don Friedman, who is a colleague who has worked with him on many projects. So we took Don's advice, and we are turning it over to Jared to pose questions, both from historical perspective, but also from his contemporary experience and his work on buildings, historical and I suppose the removal of historical buildings in some cases for the new ones that replace them. So, so Jared, please take it over.
All right, great. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Don. I've been following both of you for some time. I've got your got your books here, and it was great to hear your thoughts regarding foundations. I'd say that as a geotechnical engineer, I appreciated hearing what you had to say. And I guess from an experience standpoint, I went to school at University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. So my grad studies, we talked a lot about what happened in Chicago. And as a professional, a lot of my career, 15 years working in New York City. And, the more projects you work on, the more you understand that there was a reason why something was done in a particular way. Just trying to backtrack what that is helpful to understand. I mean, we saw foundations that had piles, masonry, steel, and granite, all in the same, underneath the same column. And it's like, why was it done that way? And, looking at the drawings that you're able to gather, I think that for any professionals on the line, it's important for us to remember that, painstaking hours were spent documenting these foundations from the standpoint of what was proposed, and in some cases, the as-built conditions. So if you're working on a project and you want to add a floor to it, or you want to work alongside it, if you dig long enough, you can find these documents. They can help you out a lot. I mean, just a lot of those pile drawings that were shown in New York City, a lot of those piles, each one of those circles is good for about 20 to 25 tons. So knowing that and what the code was back then, it helps to get a sense of the load takedown to get an idea of what was thought of back then. So as we look at these, I'm reminded of the bedrock myth. And I say that because, there's this notion that you look at the type of buildings that are in a place like Manhattan and the high buildings are where the rock is shallow, but that's not true. That's not true. I mean, we've worked on a number of projects and we've seen that you didn't have to just have shallow bedrock in order to have a tall building. And we're seeing that in Chicago. We're seeing that if you look at the VLA map, we can see that there are areas where rock was very deep, but in order to get a foundation in, you just went deeper to get down to it. So it's very interesting to see it when you show it that way. And I think that the break lines and some of the last few images we saw, those break lines, if we were to eliminate those break lines and we were to kind of extrude things to show them at their natural scale, we would see that when we talk about skyscrapers, one of the missing elements in that discussion is what is happening below ground. So hopefully tonight, we're able to get more of an appreciation of just what had to go in to get a foundation into the ground. And the notion of the caisson, we see that there were some elements in the local vernacular that could cause confusion at face value, right? If you said that, you know, a pneumatic caisson was totally different from a caisson or a belled pier of what you were seeing in Chicago. I would like to ask a question. When you're looking for drawings like this, where are you going? In Chicago, where are you going? In New York, where are you going to kind of fill in those blanks? Because I know somebody on the line is wondering that. And I'd like to hear what your thoughts are there.
Go ahead, Don.
If I'm doing research for something like tonight, I would say the buildings that you're going to find the drawings for are the ones that were important enough or peculiar enough to make it into the journals. So, for example, some of those drawings I had were from the Engineering News and Engineering Record. If you're very lucky, drawings may exist in an archive, but I think, you know, in our projects, we get drawings from an archive, maybe 1 out of 20 buildings, maybe less. So if you know, we've worked on the Park Row building, and we actually got more and better drawings from the old journals than we got from looking in archives.
Okay, great. Tom, any input for Chicago?
Well, if it's a Halliburton Roche building, you can be pretty sure that the drawings are in the Chicago History Museum. After that, you're rolling the dice. Agree with Don that, you know, there are a handful that the foundation drawings were published, and so they're pretty well known. But it's also you know, a little bit of a dice roll. There's a lot of unknown stuff under there for sure, and the smaller or more obscure the building, the less likely it is that there's any certain knowledge about what they're on. There has been a lot of research. I mean, there's a small army of researchers over the last century that's documented foundations in Chicago. Ralph Peck, in 1943, put together a little brochure at the University of Illinois. Also a fellow alumnus, Jared. Glad to hear that. And the Randall book on the history of building construction in Chicago is very good about identifying foundation types. And from that, you can usually extrapolate, you know, roughly what's going to be under a building, even if you don't know exactly where the individual elements are.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, Professor Ralph Peck signed 2 of my Soul Mechanics books when I was back in school. True rock star. Yeah. I just jotted down a note here when I was looking at some of the variations that you see across a building. I said load variation informs foundations, and geology has to be considered as well. So for each one of these projects, you know, the geology doesn't care anything about the property line. So you really do have to have an understanding of what's happening below ground in order to get these foundations in. I'd be curious, in your research, that edge condition is something that becomes very, very challenging. I know that on foundations now, we have eccentric loads. A lot of times we're putting in tie-down anchors to kind of resolve that uplift. But if either one of you want to speak to how that was handled in the past, it looks like it was just a larger footing or larger caisson that was installed or constructed.
A larger footing, and then very often, as Don showed, a very heavy cantilever girder that's sticking out from it, so that the cantilever girder is supported on the center of a grillage foundation or a caisson, and then there's really a giant girder that holds up the edge. And the best example of this in Chicago is William LeBaron Jennings' Manhattan building, which has a very tall center piece and then two smaller wings. And Jenny wrote that the reason the wings are smaller was that was as much load as he was willing to put on the cantilever girders, right? Not the foundations themselves, but it was the girders themselves that worried him about being able to carry the load of more than 8 or 9 stories.
Those cantilever girders are they're basically strap footings, only the strap is steel rather than concrete. So today we would build a strap footing, we would build 2 footings and build a piece of concrete connecting them that can take the moment. And they just were using different materials. The other thing, and back to your research question, I got a lot of information about foundations when I was doing research by reading the various lawsuits from neighbors. When they built the old New York Times building on Park Row, they damaged the neighboring building along the lot line shared. And it was a lawsuit that building was built in the 1880s. And I was reading the appeal of the lawsuit from 1910. And someone had written on the copy of the book that was that Google scanned, it was in Google Books, party wall issue. That was their summation of this endless lawsuit. But when you got into the testimony, there was a very good description of the foundations of the New York Times building. So I will say that sometimes the information shows up in unexpected places.
Yeah, no, that's true.
Yeah, let me interject here. Another source for research that exists in New York in some collections, like the Skyscraper Museum. And Tom, we were talking earlier, and these are progress photos of construction. I showed a couple in some of the frames earlier. The Bankers Trust collection, for example, is a series of about 100 or so progress photos of 3 eras of the construction of the building that's on the corner of Wall Street and Nassau Street. So 14 Wall Street, which was originally the Gillender building, 18-story skyscraper, 23 feet wide by 73 feet on the lot, that was demolished, was built in 1897, and it was demolished in 1910. And we have the progress of the demolition of the Gillender building, and then digging the foundations and the rise of the Bankers Trust, the first phase of that. And then there's a 1930s. So it's a wonderful set of construction photos that I found in the building manager's office at 14 Wall Street when Deutsche Bank occupied the building. And they were donated to the museum. We digitized them. I encourage people to go onto our website where you can see these. And Don has been involved for a long time in caption writing for the Skyscraper Museum, and Derek Trelstead wrote the ones that are on the Bankers Trust collection. We also have the Empire State Building. We could show some of those later, and we will show them in the course of the various segments, phases of construction in the other lectures. But Tom, you mentioned to me in an email that it's really hard to find serial construction views of Chicago buildings, and perhaps you could paint that picture a little more clearly, because certainly if anybody would have found them, it would have been you by now.
Well, you do see occasional snapshots, but they're pretty rare. The best set that I know of is of the Fisher building, and even that is just sort of a handful, maybe 5 or 6 fairly grainy, not very good photographs. My own hunch is that the buildings were going up so fast and there was so much going on that no one thought to document them in the same way that they were clearly documented in New York. It just didn't seem like they memorialized the process in quite the same way. Not to say they weren't interested in it. Jenny in particular wrote a lot about the techniques that went into his buildings. Just photography didn't seem to be the way that they documented them. There are many more drawings, for example, than photography in the era. And I don't know that, certainly there's other photography in Chicago. It just seems that it wasn't aimed at building sites quite so much.
And just having that information before you start a project is so important. I can think of projects now that we've worked on where, knowing that there was going to be grillage in the foundation, that's something that informed the design. If we have any flexibility of where these columns are, make them so they're not coincidental with things that you're going to have to remove. It's a known obstruction if you know about it. So having that information, it's important. And I can think of several times, as Carol alluded to, where you're downstairs in the basement and you go to some dark room somewhere and there's a pail that's got drawings in it. So, oh, those things. And it's like, yeah, those old things are priceless for a project, priceless. And I think that, as problem solvers, as engineers, considering what works elsewhere is important to inform our designs. And I like how, in Chicago, you had the grain elevators, right? These big, heavy structures that are on the worst soil in town. And it's like, wait, why can't we consider doing piles like that? And then just a few miles east, right? You go to New York and we're looking at what's happening with mid-river piers and saying, wait, why couldn't we do that for foundations? So I think that that's just fascinating that you're both looking in your different corners and you're seeing that we were doing those things. We have some questions in the chat and we should probably try to gather some of those. I think we're ending at 7. Is that right? So we got 9 minutes here.
So we only have about 10 minutes. The questions I've monitored so far are quite specific.
Okay.
People are interested in piles and how they were driven. But I wonder if since we have so little time, you can answer that question, either of you. And actually, I think that question of process relates to the progress photos of construction, when you can see a project 3 times a week and the machinery that's brought onto the site in these different phases really provide us with an invaluable record of the construction process and the construction industry and the trades. It's sad that this doesn't exist for Chicago, but it is also surprising how little that material has kind of entered, how little history of construction exists in the published scholarship, how the expertise resides in people like Don and Jared, who see the remnants of this work, and Don, who fortunately has recorded it for us. But there does seem to be a kind of catch-up that's needed in the area of construction history. And I'll mention that next week, Brian Bowen, who helped to start Construction History Association of America, following the British model, will be the commentator. And so I think we'll continue to talk in each one of these sessions about that question, about what can we really learn about how buildings were built with the materials, with the labor, the trades. I don't, that's not really a question, but maybe there's some comments that either Tom or Don have about that.
I will mention that Tom and I first met when Brian was organizing the Construction History Society and dragged the two of us into a conversation on that topic. You get, again, I'm going to come back to the old journals talk about this stuff specifically because these were cutting edge questions in the technology of construction at the time. So the engineering news, the engineering record, the architectural record to some degree will talk about process, because they weren't just talking about what got built, but their goal as journals was to explain what was going on. So to some degree, you can get that story by reading the journals. But I have to say, picture's worth 1,000 words. One good photograph of a pile driving process. And somebody asked that question. Piles were driven the same way they're driven now. You drop a heavy weight on it repeatedly until it goes into the ground. The only difference is that they were dropping the heavy weight by using a steam engine to lift it and then unleashing it. A photograph makes it much clearer. Of our 4 lectures, this is the one where most of the stuff is invisible when it's built. So the photographs are all sort of secondary stuff, or most of the time. You're seeing the machine above ground driving the pile. You don't actually see the pile. So you have to make inferences.
Yeah, I think that another way to fill in the blanks is also looking at the local building codes at that era, especially if you're trying to get an idea of what the presumptive loads were and things of that sort. Tom, I think you were going to say something.
No, it was just following on from Don, but yeah, that's absolutely right. Interestingly, one of the best sources for foundations in Chicago is the local newspapers, because it was quite a debate. And you actually, get real arguments about which type of foundation is, safe or which one isn't. Soy Smith lectured on his proposal for foundations, and you could watch the reactions from Jenny and Adler, especially, sort of see the wheels turning. Soy Smith in that lecture also thought that steel construction was a short-lived fad and that we'd all go back to limestone piers, and there was a fair amount of discussion on that as well. But to think about construction as a topic that held enough public interest that it would take up newspaper space, that to me is fascinating. And Carol, to your point, it does go to the idea that there are histories out there, even on something as seemingly minor as foundations, that are important and meaningful, but also are really good stories, right? That bring in personalities and start to connect to all sorts of other things in the culture of building.
You definitely see those personalities in some of the journal articles where, especially like Engineering News, people were bragging about their latest and greatest approaches, right? What was happening regionally. So you really do see those personalities. So I definitely encourage folks to check that out if they haven't. All right, well, as a time check, looks like we've got 3 minutes into the top of the hour. I guess there was a question about sub-basements. We didn't talk a lot about what was done for perimeter support. You hinted at underpinning, but if you want to give any commentary for how folks were creating these excavations, especially if you had to go below groundwater, it'd be great if we could hear some thoughts there before the closing remarks.
For New York, they typically didn't go below groundwater. A lot of times they would dig more or less right up to it. But you can tell where either the bedrock or groundwater is in New York by how far down people dug. Where they could go down 3 stories, they did. Where they could only go down a half story, they did. So you can track the difficulty by what people built. Tom, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh no! Again, the difference between the two cities is the variation in the soil in New York. In Chicago, that hardpan layer is something that you don't want to bother trying to dig out because it's so tough. But also, because that hardpan was formed by the retreating lake, the water table and the hardpan layer are just about the same place. So, you do start to see subbasements. People get brave enough to go down maybe 2 stories, but then that's it, because they're all many, many different problems once you go down any further than that. So the sub basement only goes down as far as that 15 or 16 feet typically from the original ground line.
Yeah, that's definitely a nice clue. I can remember being in basements where you see the rock outcrop and it just coming out of the slab, and you say, "Well, I see why they stopped at that depth," right?
Yeah.
All right, great. Well, Carol, I don't know who should have the last word, so I'm giving it to you.
Okay.
We've got 1 minute.
I think I'm going to invite people to come back for the next 3 episodes. Next week with frames, we're going to connect the knee bone to the hip bone as we begin the skeleton to rise. We will also, in the context of these other lenses to bring onto the structural engineering and architectural problems, bring these other topics of labor, of building regulation, building codes into the discussion. So we had only a beginning to make our complicated outline of the layers of these kind of histories, where we can take a slice through these different topics in order to also take different historical strands that were that we'll be able to separate and examine under the microscope the way that we did with foundations today. So thank you all who have stayed with us through this and who will watch it in the future. Episode 1 is followed next week, next Tuesday. Then there's a break of 1 week, and then there are 2 more sessions after that, and then a final 5th on the Mills building. So Don Friedman and Tom Leslie will be back next time, same time next week. Jared Green, thank you so much for joining us this evening and for your contemporary perspective and experience. And everybody, we'll see you next time. Onward to frames.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Take it easy, everybody. All right, bye now.
Bye.